The night had been quiet for hours, the kind of stillness that made even the ticking clock on the wall feel louder than usual. Inside the small hospital, most of the lights were dimmed, and only a few staff members moved through the halls. A nurse at the front desk rubbed her eyes, trying to stay awake, while a doctor leaned against the counter, flipping through patient charts without much urgency. It felt like one of those nights that would pass slowly and uneventfully. Then everything changed. The first ambulance arrived without warning, its siren breaking through the silence like a sudden storm. The sound echoed through the building, pulling everyone to attention. The nurse at the desk straightened immediately, her tiredness gone in an instant. The doctor dropped the file in his hands and rushed toward the emergency entrance. Before anyone could fully process what was happening, a second ambulance pulled in behind the first. Then a third. The calm night shattered. Doors swung open. Voices rose. Footsteps hurried across the floor. Patients were rushed inside on stretchers, each one needing urgent care. The air filled with tension, confusion, and urgency all at once. "We need more hands," someone called out. Staff members who had been moving slowly just moments ago were now rushing in every direction. Equipment was pulled out. Monitors beeped to life. Instructions were shouted across the room, sometimes overlapping, sometimes lost in the noise. In the middle of all this, she stepped forward. No one had noticed her earlier. She had been there, quietly standing near the back, observing. She wasn't part of the regular team. In fact, most of the staff didn't even recognize her. She wore simple scrubs, nothing that set her apart, nothing that suggested anything unusual. But when the chaos began, she didn't hesitate. She moved with purpose, slipping into the center of the emergency room as if she had always belonged there. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, taking everything in, the number of patients, the available staff, the equipment, the confusion. "Start with airway checks," she said, her voice calm but firm. It wasn't loud, but somehow it cut through the noise. A few heads turned toward her. The doctor who had been giving orders paused for a brief second, surprised. There was something about the way she spoke. Clear, steady, certain. "Get oxygen on him," she added, already moving toward one of the patients. "You check her pulse again. It's weak." For a moment, no one questioned her. It was as if her confidence filled the room, pushing aside the uncertainty that had been building. She reached the first patient and quickly assessed the situation. Her hands moved carefully but without hesitation, adjusting equipment, checking signs, making small but critical decisions. "Stay with me," she said softly to the patient, even though there was no response. Another nurse nearby hesitated. "Should we wait for?" "No," she replied gently but firmly. "We don't have time." There was no arrogance in her tone, only urgency and focus. One by one, she moved between patients, guiding the others without making a show of it. She didn't raise her voice or demand attention, but people began to follow her instructions. Even the doctor who had first taken charge found himself listening, watching, and then quietly stepping back to let her continue. It wasn't something anyone decided. It just happened. The room, which had felt scattered and overwhelmed moments before, slowly began to organize itself around her. "Focus here," she said to a young nurse who looked frozen with uncertainty. "You're doing fine. Just keep going." Her words were simple, but they steadied shaking hands. Time started to blur. Minutes passed, though it felt like seconds. The pressure didn't ease, but the panic did. Under her direction, the team began to work together instead of against the chaos. She noticed everything. A monitor beeping too fast, a patient's breathing changing slightly, a piece of equipment not set correctly. Small details that could easily be missed in a situation like this. And she acted on each one without delay. At one point, a doctor stepped closer to her. "Who are you?" he asked, not out of suspicion, but out of genuine confusion. She didn't look up. "Right now, that doesn't matter," she said quietly. "We need to keep them stable." There was no time for more questions. Another patient was brought in, adding to the already overwhelming situation. For a brief moment, it seemed like everything might slip out of control again. But she adjusted instantly. Move him there, she said, pointing to a space that had just been cleared. We can't waste seconds. Her calm never broke. Even when something didn't go as expected, she adapted without panic. Her face remained focused, her movements steady. Those around her began to notice something else, something harder to explain. It wasn't just skill. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence, the way she seemed to anticipate problems before they fully appeared. It felt like she had been in situations like this many times before, but no one recognized her. That thought lingered in the back of their minds, even as they worked. One nurse whispered to another, "Have you seen her before?" The other shook her head quickly. "No, but she knows exactly what she's doing." There was no time to wonder further. She moved to another patient, gently adjusting their position, speaking softly again. "You're going to be okay," she said, even if she couldn't be sure. There was something comforting in her voice, something that made the chaos feel a little less overwhelming. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. Patients who had arrived in critical condition started to stabilize. One by one. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't easy, but the changes were there. The signs improved. The urgency shifted into careful monitoring. The room began to breathe again. Still, she didn't slow down. She continued moving, checking, guiding, adjusting. She didn't celebrate small victories or pause to acknowledge what had already been done. Her focus stayed on what still needed attention. The doctor who had first been in charge watched her closely now. There was a mix of relief and curiosity in his expression. "She's something else," he murmured under his breath. Another staff member nodded. "It's like she's been waiting for this." No one could explain it, but everyone could feel it. The clock on the wall kept ticking, marking each passing minute. And in those minutes, lives were being pulled back from the edge. The nurse at the front desk, who had felt so tired earlier, now stood near the doorway, watching everything unfold. Her eyes followed the woman moving through the room, trying to understand how someone could walk into this kind of chaos and bring it under control so quickly. It didn't feel normal. Felt like something more. But there was no time to think too deeply about it. Another instruction was given. Another task completed. The rhythm of the room had changed completely. Where there had been panic, there was now focus. Where there had been confusion, there was now direction. And at the center of it all, she remained calm. Almost too calm. As if this wasn't new to her. As if she had done this before. And that quiet thought stayed with everyone who saw her that night. Who was she? And how did she know exactly what to do when no one else did? No one asked out loud anymore. Not yet. Because for now, one thing mattered more than anything else. She was saving them. The rush did not slow down after the first wave. If anything, the pressure grew heavier as the minutes passed. The emergency room was still full. Every bed occupied. Every monitor active. Every pair of hands busy. But something had changed. The chaos that had filled the room earlier was now replaced with a steady, controlled urgency. And at the center of it all, she kept moving. Her pace never felt rushed, yet she was always exactly where she needed to be. She shifted from one patient to another, checking details others might miss, adjusting treatments, guiding the staff with short, clear instructions. "Lower it slightly. Not too much," she said to a nurse adjusting a setting. "Stay with her. Watch the breathing pattern," she told another. Her voice stayed calm, even when the situation around her wasn't. The doctors had stopped questioning her. At some point, they had simply accepted her presence, her decisions, her quiet authority. It wasn't something they talked about. It just happened naturally, like falling into a rhythm that worked. One of the senior doctors stood beside her for a moment, watching closely as she worked. "You've done this before," he said quietly. She didn't look at him right away. Her attention remained on the patient in front of her as she checked a reading, then adjusted the blanket gently. "Yes," she replied after a short pause. There was something in the way she said it. Not proud, not hesitant, just simple truth. "Where?" he asked, lowering his voice. This time, she glanced at him briefly. There was no fear in her eyes, but there was something else. Something guarded. In places that didn't have time for mistakes, she said. Before he could ask anything more, she had already moved on to the next patient. The answer stayed with him. Around the room, small signs of her experience continued to show. She anticipated changes before the monitors reflected them. She noticed when someone was about to make a mistake and corrected it gently, without making them feel small. "Take a breath," she told a young nurse whose hands were shaking slightly. "You're doing it right. Just trust yourself." The nurse nodded, swallowing her fear, and continued with more confidence. That was another thing about her. She didn't just give orders. She steadied people. She made them feel like they could handle the situation, even when it felt overwhelming. As time passed, the staff began to rely on her more openly. "What do you think?" one of the doctors asked her at one point. She paused for a second, considering, then gave a short, clear answer. "We continue as we are. Watch closely. Don't rush the next step." He nodded without hesitation. It was unusual. Normally, decisions like that came from the most senior person in the room. But tonight, things were different. No one argued with her judgment. No one felt the need to. A nurse near the back whispered quietly to another, "She's not even part of our team, is she?" The other shook her head. "I checked earlier. I don't think she's on the schedule." They both looked toward her again. "Then how does she know all this?" the first one asked. There was no answer. The question hung in the air, unspoken by most, but felt by everyone. She continued working unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, about the attention she was drawing. Her focus never left the patients. At one bed, she adjusted a patient's position and spoke softly again, her voice gentle in contrast to the urgency around her. "You're not alone," she said. The patient didn't respond, but the words still seemed to matter. Moments like that didn't go unnoticed. A nurse watching nearby felt something shift inside her. The fear she had been holding on to since the chaos began started to fade, replaced by something steadier. Hope. It was a quiet feeling, but it spread. Another patient showed signs of improvement. Then another. Each small change added to the growing sense that things were turning around. But the pressure never fully lifted. There were still risks, still moments where things could go wrong. And she knew it. That was why she never slowed down. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning, checking, thinking ahead. It was as if she was always a few steps ahead of everyone else. At one point, a machine gave a sudden alert, sharp and unexpected. A nurse froze. Before anyone else could react, she was already there. "Adjust the line," she said quickly, her hands moving with precision. The nurse followed her instruction, and within seconds, the alert stopped. The situation stabilized. "It's okay," she added quietly, giving the nurse a brief, reassuring look. The nurse nodded, exhaling slowly. That moment stayed with her. Later, as she moved to another patient, the same senior doctor approached her again. "You're leading this entire room," he said, almost as if he was realizing it for the first time. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she checked a patient's pulse, made a small adjustment, then finally spoke. "I'm helping," she said. "That's more than helping," he replied. She gave a faint, almost unnoticeable smile, but it didn't last long. Her attention shifted again. There was something about her that made it clear she wasn't there for recognition. She wasn't trying to stand out. If anything, it felt like she was trying to stay in the background, even while being at the center of everything. And that only made the curiosity around her grow stronger. One of the nurses noticed something else as she passed by. A small mark near her wrist. It looked old, faint, but not accidental. The nurse didn't say anything, but her mind began to wonder. There were pieces of a story here, pieces that didn't quite fit together yet. As the minutes continued to pass, the room grew calmer. Not quiet, but calmer. The urgency shifted into careful monitoring and steady work. The worst of the storm seemed to be passing. And through it all, she remained the same. Focused, calm, unshaken. It was as if the chaos had no power over her. Or maybe, she had simply faced worse before. That thought settled quietly in the minds of those around her. Whoever she was, she wasn't ordinary. And yet, she worked alongside them as if she was just another member of the team. No introductions. No explanations. Just action. At one point, she paused briefly, standing still for the first time since everything began. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the patients, the staff, the equipment. For a second, her expression softened. Not with relief, but with something deeper. Something personal. Then it was gone. She stepped forward again, continuing her work as if that moment had never happened. The clock kept moving, and with every passing minute, the outcome of this night became clearer. Lives were being saved, but the question remained. Who was she really? And why did it feel like this night meant more to her than anyone else in that room? By the time the clock moved past the next hour mark, something in the room had quietly shifted. The urgency that once pressed against every second had begun to loosen its grip. The monitors still hummed and beeped. Staff still moved from one patient to another, but the sharp edge of panic was gone. One by one, the patients who had arrived in critical condition were no longer slipping. Their breathing steadied. Their vitals became more stable. The small signs added up, and soon it became clear. 7 lives had been pulled back from the edge within a single hour. No one said it out loud at first. It felt almost too heavy to put into words. A nurse near the center of the room finally exhaled deeply, her shoulders dropping for the first time since the chaos had begun. "They're stable," she whispered, almost to herself. Another staff member nodded, glancing at the monitors again, just to be sure. All of them. The realization spread slowly, like a quiet wave. 7. In 60 minutes. It didn't feel real. The senior doctor stepped back, running a hand over his face, as if trying to wake himself from a dream. He looked around the room, taking in the patients, the staff, the equipment that was now finally still. Then his eyes found her. She stood near one of the beds, adjusting a blanket gently, her movements careful and precise as always. There was no sign of celebration in her expression. No relief, no pride. Just the same quiet focus she had carried from the very beginning. "You did it," the doctor said, his voice low but clear. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she finished what she was doing, then stepped back slightly, giving the patient space. Only then did she glance toward him. "We did," she corrected softly. It was a simple answer, but it carried weight. The doctor studied her for a moment. He wanted to say more, to ask more, but something held him back. Maybe it was the way she avoided attention. Maybe it was the feeling that there was more to her than she was willing to share. Around them, the room began to breathe again. A few nurses exchanged tired smiles. Someone leaned against a wall, closing their eyes for a brief second. Another quietly cleaned up equipment, the steady rhythm of their movements replacing the earlier chaos. Relief was there, but it wasn't loud. It was quiet, deep, real. And in the middle of it, she remained distant. She moved from one patient to another, double-checking everything as if the work wasn't finished yet. She adjusted a line here, checked a reading there, making sure nothing was overlooked. "You should rest," a nurse said to her gently. "You've been going non-stop." She shook her head slightly. "Not yet." Her voice wasn't tired, but there was something else in it. Something that sounded like she wasn't ready to stop. The nurse didn't push. There was a moment when she paused again, standing near the far side of the room. Her eyes moved across the patients, one after another. There was a softness there now, something that hadn't been visible during the rush. It wasn't relief. It felt more personal than that, as if each life saved meant something deeper to her than anyone else could understand. A young nurse who had been watching her all night stepped a little closer. "Are you part of another hospital?" she asked carefully. The woman looked at her for a second, as if deciding how much to say. "No," she replied. "Then, how did you?" "I've seen situations like this before," she said gently, cutting the question short without sounding dismissive. The young nurse nodded, though it didn't fully answer what she wanted to know. Nothing about her answers ever did. Before the conversation could continue, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. At first, no one paid much attention. The hospital had been busy all night. People came and went. But then the footsteps grew louder, heavier, more deliberate. A few heads turned toward the entrance. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Something about the way those footsteps sounded, steady, coordinated, felt different from the usual movement of hospital staff. The senior doctor noticed it too. His expression changed slightly as he looked toward the doorway. Then the doors opened. 3 individuals stepped inside, dressed in dark jackets, their presence sharp and unmistakable. They weren't medical staff. They weren't visitors. They carried themselves with purpose. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with relief. Conversations stopped. Movements slowed. Everyone felt it. The shift. One of the individuals stepped forward, scanning the room with a focused gaze. His eyes moved from one face to another, as if searching. "Is everyone stable?" he asked, his tone calm but official. The senior doctor stepped forward, still trying to process the sudden change. "Yes," he replied cautiously. "We've managed to stabilize them." The man gave a small nod, acknowledging the answer. Then his eyes continued moving, searching, until they stopped on her. She stood near the far side of the room, exactly where she had been moments before. She hadn't moved. She hadn't stepped back or tried to blend into the background. She simply stood there, calm. The man's expression didn't change much, but there was a clear recognition in his eyes. "There you are," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. A quiet murmur spread among the staff. "Do they know her? Who are they? Why are they here?" No one had answers. The young nurse who had spoken to her earlier felt her chest tighten slightly. She glanced at the woman, expecting some reaction. But there was none. No surprise, no fear, just calm. The woman took a small step forward, her posture steady. "You took your time," she said quietly. The man's expression shifted just slightly, almost like a brief acknowledgement. "We came as soon as we could." The exchange felt strange to everyone watching. This wasn't how someone spoke to unexpected visitors. This felt familiar. The senior doctor stepped closer, confusion clear on his face. "What is this?" he asked. "Who are you?" The man didn't look at him right away. His attention remained on her. Then, after a moment, he spoke. "We're here for her." The words landed heavily in the room. A nurse near the back let out a small, shocked breath. "For her." The doctor's confusion deepened. "For what reason?" There was a pause. The man finally turned his attention to the doctor, his tone still calm, but firm. "That's something we'll need to discuss." The answer didn't satisfy anyone. If anything, it made things worse. The room, which had just moments ago been filled with quiet relief, now felt tense again. Not chaotic, but uncertain. All eyes turned back to her. She stood there, completely composed, as if this moment had always been coming, as if she had been expecting it. The young nurse took a step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know them?" The woman didn't look at her. "Yes," she said simply. The nurse's heart sank slightly. There was something in that answer that felt final. The senior doctor looked between them, trying to understand what was happening. "You can't just walk in here and take someone," he said, his voice more firm now. "She just helped save lives." The man nodded once. "We're aware." "Then you understand she's needed here," the doctor continued. Another pause. The man's expression softened just slightly, but his words didn't change. "She's needed elsewhere too." Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. The woman finally moved again, stepping away from the patient she had been standing beside. Her eyes moved across the room one last time. The patients. The staff. The place that had just witnessed something extraordinary. There was that same softness in her expression again. But it didn't last. When she looked back at the individuals who had arrived, her face returned to calm. "I'll come with you," she said. The words felt like a quiet ending to something no one had fully understood. The young nurse felt a sudden urge to speak, to ask her to stay, to ask anything at all. But the words didn't come. No one stopped her. No one knew how. And as she took another step forward, leaving the center of the room behind. One thought stayed with everyone watching. They had just seen something incredible, but they still didn't know who she really was. The room didn't move for a few seconds after she spoke. "I'll come with you." The words settled into the air like something final. No one rushed to respond. No one even seemed sure how to react. Just minutes ago, this same room had been filled with urgency, fear, and determination. Now it was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This silence carried questions. The senior doctor took a step forward, unable to hold back anymore. "Wait," he said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "You can't just leave like this." She turned slightly toward him, her expression calm, almost gentle. "They're stable now," she said. "That's not the point," he replied quickly. "You came in here, took control when we needed it most, and now people walk in asking for you like this?" He glanced toward the agents, then back at her. "We deserve to know who you are." A few nurses nodded quietly in agreement. The young nurse who had spoken to her earlier stood still, watching closely, her hands clasped together as if holding on to something she couldn't explain. For a moment it looked like she might not answer. Then she stepped a little closer, just enough so her voice wouldn't carry across the entire room. "I understand," she said softly, "but some things aren't mine to explain." The answer wasn't cold. It wasn't dismissive, but it didn't give them what they wanted. The doctor exhaled slowly, trying to process her words. "You just saved 7 lives, he said, lowering his voice. "That makes it your story too." Something in her expression shifted for a brief second. Not guilt, not regret, something heavier. "I didn't do it alone," she said again, as if holding on to that truth mattered more than anything else. Behind her, one of the agents stepped forward slightly. Not in a threatening way, just enough to remind everyone why they were there. "We don't have much time," he said. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was clear. The moment was moving forward, whether anyone was ready or not. A quiet tension spread through the room again. The young nurse finally found her voice. "Are you in trouble?" she asked, her words hesitant. The question hung in the air. Everyone waited. She turned her head slightly toward the nurse. There was a softness in her eyes again, the same kind that had been there when she spoke to the patients. "No," she said. The answer came without hesitation, but it didn't remove the unease. "If you're not in trouble, then why are they here?" the nurse asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked toward the agents, then back at the nurse. "It's complicated," she said quietly. The nurse swallowed, unsure whether to ask more or stay silent. Around them, the rest of the staff stood still, watching the exchange unfold. No one returned to their tasks. No one looked away. Felt like something important was about to be revealed. The senior doctor crossed his arms slightly, his voice calmer now but still firm. "We're not asking for everything," he said. "Just something that makes sense." For a moment it seemed like she might refuse again. But then she glanced around the room, at the faces that had trusted her without question, at the people who had followed her lead when everything was falling apart. And slowly she spoke. "I wasn't supposed to be here tonight," she said. The room stayed silent. "I was passing through," she continued. "Something else brought me into this building." "What kind of something else?" the doctor asked. She hesitated. Then carefully she chose her words. "I used to work in places where emergencies didn't come with warning," she said. "Where there wasn't always enough time or enough people or enough resources." Her voice remained steady, but there was a quiet weight behind it now. "I learned to make decisions fast," she added, "because waiting wasn't an option." The doctor studied her closely. "That still doesn't explain them." He nodded slightly toward the agents. One of them stepped forward again, this time meeting the doctor's gaze directly. "She has experience that's difficult to replace," he said. "And there are situations where that experience is needed." "That sounds like a vague answer," the doctor replied. "It's the only one we can give," the agent said. There was no hostility in his voice, but there was a clear boundary. The doctor looked frustrated, but he didn't push further. The answers were coming in pieces, and none of them felt complete. The young nurse looked back at her. So, you're not just a nurse, she said quietly. A small pause followed. Then, almost reluctantly, she shook her head. No, she said. The word felt heavier than anything else she had said so far. A quiet murmur passed through the room. It confirmed what many had already started to suspect. She wasn't ordinary. She never had been. Then why stay quiet about it? Another nurse asked. Why not tell us from the start? She gave a faint, tired smile. Because tonight wasn't about me, she said. The simplicity of the answer made it harder to argue with. For a moment no one spoke. The truth, even in its incomplete form, settled over them. She had stepped into chaos, taken control, saved lives, and asked for nothing in return. No recognition, no explanation, nothing. The senior doctor let out a slow breath, some of his tension easing. You could have left at any time, he said. No one would have blamed you. She nodded slightly. Maybe. But you didn't. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The reason was already clear. The agent glanced at his watch, then back at her. We really do need to go, he said. This time there was no room for delay. She nodded once. I know. The young nurse took a small step forward, as if trying to hold onto the moment just a little longer. Will we ever see you again? She asked. The question felt more personal than anything else that had been said. For the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. She looked at the nurse, then around the room once more. I don't know, she admitted. It was honest, and somehow that made it harder. The nurse nodded slowly, her eyes lowering for a second before she looked back up again. Thank you, she said. The words were simple, but they carried everything she couldn't fully express. Others began to echo it quietly. Thank you. For everything. You saved them. The room filled with soft voices. Not loud, not overwhelming, but real. She stood there for a moment, taking it in. Not as recognition, but as something human. Something that mattered. Then she gave a small nod. You would have done the same, she said. The doctor shook his head slightly. Not like that. A faint smile touched her face again, brief but genuine. Then it faded. Without another word, she turned toward the agents. They stepped aside to let her pass, their presence still firm, still purposeful, but no longer as tense as before. As she walked toward the exit, her steps were steady. No hesitation, no looking back at first. But just before she reached the door, she paused. For a brief second, she turned her head slightly, her eyes moving across the room one last time. The patients, the staff, the place where, for 1 hour, everything had changed. Then she stepped forward again. The doors opened, and she was gone. The room remained still for a long moment after that. No one rushed to fill the silence. No one knew quite what to say. It wasn't just that she had left. It was the feeling she left behind. Questions, respect, and something deeper. The young nurse finally spoke again, her voice soft. Who do you think she really is? No one answered, because no one knew. But one thing was certain. She hadn't just been a stranger who walked in and helped. She had been something more, something they might never fully understand. And yet, for one unforgettable hour, she had been exactly what they needed. The doors closed behind her, and for a long moment, no one inside the hospital moved. It felt as if the room was still holding on to her presence, as if something important had just passed through and left a space behind. The machines continued their steady rhythm, and the patients remained stable, but the energy had changed again. The senior doctor slowly turned back toward the room, exhaling deeply. All right, he said quietly, more to ground himself than anyone else. Let's make sure everything stays steady. The staff returned to their work, but the silence lingered. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was thoughtful. Every movement felt more careful, more aware, as if they had all just witnessed something they couldn't fully explain. The young nurse walked over to one of the patients she had been helping earlier. She checked the monitor, adjusted the blanket, and paused for a second. "They're okay," she whispered, almost as if she needed to say it out loud. Across the room, another nurse nodded. "All 7 of them," she said. "Still stable." The words carried a quiet sense of wonder. 7 lives, in 60 minutes, still didn't feel real. The senior doctor stepped closer to the center of the room, his eyes moving from one patient to another. He checked their charts, their readings, their breathing. Everything held. "She made it look easy," one of the nurses said softly. The doctor shook his head. "It wasn't easy," he replied. "Not even close." There was a pause. "But she knew exactly what to do," the nurse added. He didn't argue with that, because it was true. The young nurse stood near the doorway now, looking toward the hallway where she had disappeared. Her mind replayed the last hour over and over again. The way she had stepped forward, the way she had spoken, the way she had stayed calm when everything else felt like it was falling apart. And then the way she left. No hesitation, no explanation, just gone. "She said she might not come back," the young nurse murmured. A quiet voice behind her responded, "People like her, they don't stay in one place." She turned slightly. It was one of the older nurses, someone who had worked in the hospital for many years. "What do you mean?" the younger one asked. The older nurse folded her arms gently, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes you meet people who carry something bigger than themselves," she said. "They go where they're needed most, and when their work is done, they move on." The younger nurse looked back toward the hallway. "That doesn't feel fair," she said quietly. The older nurse gave a small, understanding smile. "Maybe not," she replied. "But tonight, we were the ones who needed her." The words stayed with her. Across the room, the senior doctor sat down for the first time since the chaos had begun. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together, staring at the floor for a moment. One of the staff members approached him. "Are you okay?" they asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking about her." He gave a faint, almost tired smile. "Hard not to." There was a short silence. "She didn't even tell us her name," the staff member added. The doctor looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "Maybe she didn't want us to remember her that way," he said. "Then how?" He paused. "By what she did." The simplicity of the answer made it feel true. The young nurse stepped back into the room, still holding on to everything she had seen. She moved toward the patient she had been assigned earlier, checking everything again, even though she knew it was already stable. Her hands were steady now, more than they had been at the beginning of the night. She realized something in that moment. She wasn't the same person she had been just an hour ago. None of them were. The experience had changed something. The way they worked, the way they thought, the way they believed in themselves. "She told me to trust myself," the young nurse said quietly, almost to herself. Another nurse nearby overheard and smiled. "Then you should," she said. The younger nurse nodded. She would, because for the first time she felt like she could. Time passed slowly after that. The hospital settled back into a more familiar rhythm. New patients arrived, but nothing like the chaos from earlier. The staff worked with a quiet confidence, a sense of control that hadn't been there before. And yet, her presence lingered. In the way they spoke, in the way they moved, in the way they handled even the smallest decisions. It was as if a part of her had stayed behind. Near the end of the shift, the senior doctor gathered a few of the staff members together. "I want everyone to take a moment," he said. They looked at him, curious. "We handled something difficult tonight," he continued. "And yes, she played a big part in that." He paused, glancing briefly toward the door again. "But so did all of you." There was a quiet understanding in the room. "We learned something tonight," he added, "about teamwork, about trust, about staying calm when things feel impossible." The young nurse felt her chest tighten slightly, not with fear, but with emotion. "And we don't forget that," the doctor finished. They all nodded, because they wouldn't. Outside, the night was still dark, but the first hint of morning was beginning to show. The sky was slowly shifting, the deep darkness softening at the edges. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, she was already gone, moving forward, following whatever path had brought her there in the first place. Inside, the young nurse stepped outside for a brief moment, needing a breath of fresh air. She stood near the entrance, looking out at the quiet road. For a second, she almost expected to see her, standing there, or walking away, but there was nothing, just silence. Still, she smiled faintly. "Thank you," she whispered again, even though she knew the words wouldn't reach her. Behind her, the hospital doors opened and closed as staff moved in and out, continuing their work. Life went on, but something about that night would never leave them. Back inside, one of the patients stirred slightly, their eyes opening for the first time since they had arrived. A nurse leaned in gently. "You're okay," she said softly. The patient looked confused but calm. "You're safe," the nurse added. And it was true. All of them were safe, because someone had walked into their lives at exactly the right moment. Someone they didn't know, someone they might never see again, but someone they would never forget. The senior doctor stood near the window, watching as the sky grew lighter. He folded his arms, his expression thoughtful. "She's out there somewhere," he said quietly. No one responded. They didn't need to, because they were all thinking the same thing. Whoever she really was, whatever life she was living, she was carrying something important, something that brought her into moments like this, moments where everything could be lost, and somehow, she found a way to change the outcome. The doctor gave a small nod to himself, then turned back toward the room. There was still work to do. There always would be. But now there was something else too. A reminder that even in the most overwhelming moments, one person could make a difference. And sometimes, that person doesn't stay long enough to be understood. Only long enough to be remembered.